In the heart of post-war Tokyo, nestled among the scars of the old world and the frenetic pulse of the new, there stood a modest little cafe known as the Kuroneko-tei, the Black Cat Inn. The dimly lit establishment, swathed in the somber tones of dark wood and worn velvet, was a sanctuary of stillness amid the chaotic energy of the city. The air was thick with the bittersweet scent of freshly brewed coffee, a rich, almost tangible aroma that seemed to whisper of forgotten moments and long-lost time. For Kosuke Kindaichi, a man whose work often led him into the darker corners of the human psyche, the Black Cat Inn was more than a mere cafe. It was a refuge. It was a place to escape, to observe, and most importantly, to think. In this small, quiet enclave, surrounded by the soft murmur of hushed conversations and the clinking of teacups, he could immerse himself in his thoughts, often lost in a book or simply gazing out into the rain-slicked streets. It was on one such rainy afternoon, however, that the peaceful monotony of his routine was shattered, not by a loud crash or an unexpected commotion, but by the quiet, unsettling presence of a woman. She appeared in the cafe like a ghost, an ethereal vision of beauty and sorrow. Dressed in a formal black kimono, the fabric absorbed the light around her, rendering her figure almost otherworldly. Her face was pale, smooth as porcelain, her features finely sculpted, as if chiseled by an artist's hand. She wore an expression of profound, unspoken melancholy, a sorrow that seemed to emanate from her very being, casting a shadow over her every movement. As she entered the cafe, her footsteps were soft, measured, as though she were walking in a dream. She made no attempt to engage with anyone, no nods of greeting, no friendly exchanges. She simply moved with an almost spectral grace to a secluded table in the far corner, where she seated herself without a word. She ordered a single cup of coffee, a quiet ritual, and then, like clockwork, waited. Her presence, though silent, was anything but inconspicuous. It gripped the very atmosphere of the cafe, pulling it taut with an invisible tension. Every patron, every staff member, seemed to hold their breath in her presence, as though afraid to disturb the fragile silence that she had woven around herself. The woman in black became a fixture at the Kuroneko-tei, an enigma who appeared with unwavering regularity every afternoon at the same time. For weeks she came, always in her somber attire, always alone, and always waiting for someone who never arrived. For Kindaichi, the strange woman was more than just an intriguing figure. He was drawn to her, not by simple curiosity, but by an undeniable sense that there was more to her silent ritual than met the eye. To him, the scene unfolding each day was more than just a solitary woman waiting in vain. It was a story, one that spoke of heartbreak, of unfulfilled desires, and of a tragedy playing out in slow motion. He watched her with the keen eyes of a man who knew how to read the subtle language of human emotion. And yet, even as he observed, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play here. A mystery not just in the woman's presence, but in the very air that clung to her. Little did Kindaichi know, the answer to this riddle was already in motion, waiting for him to step in and uncover the dark and intricate web that had been carefully spun around him. The day the impossible happened, the weather was as dreary as it had been countless times before. The rain poured down in steady sheets, obscuring the view of the street beyond the cafe's fogged windows. Inside, the atmosphere was as quiet as ever, the soft murmur of voices the only sound that broke the monotony of the rain. The woman in black was at her usual table, a living portrait of sorrow. Kindaichi sat nearby, lost in thought, while his friend from the police force, Inspector Todoroki, sat across from him, nursing a cup of tea. Together, they watched as she stood, fluid and graceful, and moved towards the back of the cafe where the restroom was located. She did not hurry. She did not linger. She simply walked, her every step measured and deliberate. She entered the restroom, closed the door behind her, and then nothing. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. The stillness of the cafe began to shift, its calm mood giving way to a mounting sense of unease. Kindaichi, ever the observant one, could sense the change in the air, the subtle way the tension in the room began to thicken. It was almost imperceptible at first, a slight shift in the mood, but soon it became undeniable. The cafe's owner, a rotund, cheerful man who always wore a smile, walked over to the restroom door and knocked gently. There was no reply. He knocked again, this time louder. Silence. A third knock, this time accompanied by a worried voice calling out her name, met only with the same oppressive quiet. The man tried the handle, only to find the door locked from the inside. He called out again, this time with more urgency, but still, there was no answer. The rest of the cafe was now holding its collective breath. Kindaichi's gaze shifted from the restroom door to Inspector Todoroki, who, like him, was beginning to sense that something was terribly wrong. The cafe's owner, no longer able to ignore the rising panic in his chest, tried to force the door open. He put his shoulder to it, and with a strained grunt, pushed. The door splintered and gave way with an ominous creak, and they all rushed into the small, dimly lit room, prepared for the worst. What they found inside was not what they had expected. The space was empty, utterly, terrifyingly empty. The restroom was a small, cramped space, hardly larger than a closet. It had no windows, no other exits. The only opening, a high, barred window that was too small for a person to pass through, was clearly secure. Its iron bars rusted from years of disuse. The door, which had been locked from the inside, lay splintered on the floor, evidence of the desperate attempt to open it. But there, in the middle of the room, was nothing but emptiness. No sign of struggle, no trace of a person. The woman in black had vanished, not murdered, not escaped. She had simply disappeared. Kindaichi stood frozen, his mind racing. This was no ordinary disappearance. It was an impossibility, a riddle wrapped in an enigma. There was only one way in or out of that room, and it had been locked. The small window was too secure, too high up to be of any use. And yet, somehow, the woman had ceased to exist. The investigation began immediately, but it was a case unlike any other. There was no body, no evidence, no crime. Only a question that twisted and turned, defying all logic and reason. The police soon identified the vanished woman, Shizuko, the beautiful and melancholy wife of Hideo, a wealthy and well-respected businessman. When Hideo was questioned, he played his part perfectly. He spoke of his wife's recent sorrow, of the depression that had plagued her for months, and of the strange mood swings that had driven her to retreat into herself. His performance was flawless, a display of the perfect grieving husband, consumed by grief over the loss of a woman who, by all accounts, had been emotionally fragile. He spoke with such conviction that it was impossible to doubt his sincerity. But Kindaichi, ever the skeptic, was not interested in the why just yet. His mind was consumed with the how. He could not believe that a person could simply vanish into thin air. If the room had no other exits, then there had to be an explanation, a hidden truth that would explain the unexplainable. He knew this was no simple case of a missing person. It was something far more elaborate, a puzzle that had been carefully constructed with a master's touch. With his mind fixed on the mystery, Kindaichi returned to the Kuroneko-tei. But this time, he was not a patron. He was an investigator, a man who saw the world not in terms of people and events, but in terms of patterns, of structures that could be broken down and understood. He examined the restroom with a careful, methodical eye, noting every detail, every seemingly insignificant feature. It was then that his gaze fell upon the large, ornate mirror mounted on the back wall. It was heavy, solid, its frame bolted securely to the wall. It seemed out of place in the small, utilitarian space, an odd choice for a bathroom in such a humble establishment. Yet, Kindaichi felt an inexplicable pull towards it. His thoughts shifted to the rear wall of the cafe, which backed onto the marshy swamp that stretched out into the distance. The land was desolate, abandoned, a wasteland of muck and mud. Behind that wall, there was nothing, just swamp. And yet, there was something about the way the mirror reflected the space, something that felt deliberately theatrical, as though it were not simply a reflection, but a carefully crafted illusion. Inspector Todoroki, for his part, was focused on the grieving husband, on the mystery of the missing wife. But Kindaichi saw beyond the surface. He saw the mirror, he saw the swamp, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the room itself was a lie. Kindaichi gathered the police and Hideo back at the Black Cat Inn, his mind already at work, piecing together the threads of the mystery. As they stood in the restroom, he began not with an accusation, but with a quiet statement of fact. The woman who had vanished was not Shizuko. In that moment, the truth came crashing down. The woman who had been coming to the cafe each day in her black kimono was not Shizuko at all. She was a creation, a ghost made of silk and grease paint. The person who had been sitting at that table every afternoon, waiting in vain, was none other than Hideo himself. His face disguised in elaborate makeup, his form cloaked in the dark kimono of a woman. Hideo, once a minor player in the world of amateur kabuki theater, had perfected the art of disguise, and in his twisted genius, he had devised an elaborate ruse to cover up his wife's murder. Shizuko had died days, even weeks earlier, killed by the man who now stood before them, his eyes wide with the unmistakable look of a man who had committed the perfect crime. The entire spectacle at the cafe had been carefully orchestrated by Hideo to create a flawless alibi, a public record of his wife's disappearance that would leave investigators, including the police, baffled and unable to solve the case. He had turned his wife's murder into a mystery, a puzzle that no one could ever hope to solve. The final reveal came with the deconstruction of the sealed room itself. Kindaichi stood before the mirror, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. The trick was simple, almost elegant in its execution. The mirror was not just a mirror, it was a door. Mounted on a central pivot, it could rotate, revealing an opening that led into a hidden passage behind the wall. Hideo had locked the door from the inside, discarded his disguise, and then, with practiced ease, turned the mirror. Stepping through the concealed opening, he emerged into the swamp behind the cafe. Before leaving, he used a simple wooden wedge and a length of string to slide the bolt back into place, giving the illusion that the door had been locked from the inside. And just like that, the vanishing woman was no more. The motive for the murder was mundane: greed, jealousy, and the slow erosion of love. But the method, the execution, was a masterpiece. Hideo had crafted a crime so intricate, so theatrical, that it became a work of art in itself. But in the end, the most brilliant trick of all was not the vanishing woman. It was the illusion of an impossible crime that could never be solved. A lie so perfect that it captivated the world and drew the one person who could see through it. Kosuke Kindaichi.